Megyn Kelly and D.L. Hughley got into it a bit last night on Fox News when D.L. slammed the way the network deals with racial issues in America. Take a look.
The only place racism doesn't exist is Fox News and the police department. That's the only place. That's absolutely true.
That's insulting. You just insulted millions of people watching this channel.
And you know what? I'm insulted by the things I hear on this network, so we're even. I could care less about insulting people that insult me on a daily basis.
Is he bringing up a valid point because it's a talk show, an opinion show, or was he out of line? Throw it to the table.
I mean, Fox News in the house here, full disclosure.
Half Fox News.
Half Fox News.
Half
Fox News,
okay.
half ABC. But, you know, I don't think that was fair, that comment. Only because, you know, I've hosted a bunch of shows there. We talk about issues of race all the time. I mean, I'm on with Juan Williams all the time. These are serious issues that we delve into. So it felt like he was labeling the whole network as not willing to accept the fact that racism is something that exists in this country. And that's something that I say on air all the time, we talk about all the time. I think the issue is that what Megyn was getting at is don't rush as media people to inject racism or racial tension before we hear the whole story. Because whether we like it or not, we oftentimes shape the narrative. When you have stories coming out where you have white on black crime, or before we figure out what actually happened, a lot of people in media jump to conclusions, or we surmise, or we guess, and it shapes the narrative of how the public hears that. And it's really hard then when facts emerge to go back and say, oh, wait a minute, maybe in this particular case, this wasn't about racism.
Are you saying Fox does that on a regular basis?
No,
it's hard not to when you see, and that's why everybody wants cameras on everything.
Yes, I agree with that policy, by the way.
So when you see something as horrendous as what we saw on Monday play out with the young lady that Diamond was here,
right,
where the officer has shot her boyfriend, it's kind of hard not to see what that was. Now, maybe he was nervous, maybe the cop was nervous, but what you see is what you see. And when you look at Eric Gardner, what you see is what you see. And what shapes the narrative oftentimes is a disregard for the fact that we do have a racial issue. We do have an issue between how police are sometimes and how people of color are sometimes, and that's the discussion we don't have. And it's the shape of this particular narrative, I think, is not helped oftentimes because when it comes to race, we don't want to hear it. That's what I've seen.
I think you're right about that. I think that's a discussion. There's an issue in this country with law enforcement and community that needs to be addressed. But when these instances, like you remember the hands up, don't shoot narrative, hands up, don't shoot, people were chanting that in the streets for weeks. And then the Justice Department comes out and does a full investigation and says, hold up, that didn't hold true. That actually didn't happen. And a lot of people, I think, ran with that. So all I say is, look, before we jump to a conclusion, let's find out what happened. And if there is a racial problem, if there is racial tension, or if there is a crime committed because of race, let's call it out and condemn it. But let's first make sure that's what happened.
Well, okay.
Well, one thing is, I see what you're saying, Jedediah, when you talk about some of these stories and the idea that there are broader issues like when and where police officers, law enforcement agents should use deadly force. I totally understand there are a lot of issues in that. I think the hard part is right now with this particular movement and Black Lives Matter, the blaring punch in the face back at that movement is that, oh, well, it just doesn't exist. It's the silence factor. It's the looking past it. And so one thing I've noticed is I see what you're saying, because I do think media is a little guiltier of creating the narrative, because when you look at what's reported, we won't see necessarily the same story when it's a white cop and a white victim. So I do think the narrative is being shaped by media, but I think it's a hard message to say right now in the current climate, because the biggest opponent or the worst thing you can say to someone that's out there speaking for Black Lives Matter is, well, it doesn't exist.
I agree with
So
that.
that's like the worst.
And right, you know, the New York Times just did a poll, and according to them, you know, the race relations right now are the worst that they've been since the LA riots, according to 70% of the people that they polled. So this is going on. I think, you know, at the end of the day, we've lost our ability to empathize.